Montana Territory, 1878. The unforgiving winter winds swept across the open range of the Bitterroot Valley, carrying whispers of Apache raids and cavalry conflicts that haunted the borderlands further south. For 25-year-old Caleb Remington, those distant troubles meant little compared to the immediate challenge of keeping his small ranch alive through another brutal season. The frost-laden air burned his lungs as he surveyed the snow-covered pastures stretching before his modest cabin, a solitary figure against the vast Montana wilderness. "No use wishing for company out here," he muttered to himself, his breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. "The frontier breaks men and women alike. Better to face it alone than watch someone you care for suffer." Caleb had inherited the struggling cattle ranch 3 years earlier after his father succumbed to pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. His mother had died years before during childbirth, taking Caleb's infant sister with her. Those twin losses had carved a hollow space in his chest where warmer emotions might have flourished, leaving only grim determination and a steadfast belief that attachment invited only pain on the frontier. The young rancher moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to physical labor, his broad shoulders and lean frame testament to years of wrestling calves and mending fences. His face, handsome despite the weathering of outdoor life, remained clean-shaven except for a light stubble that appeared between his weekly shaving ritual. Golden brown hair fell across his forehead as he worked, and eyes the color of summer sage surveyed his domain with pride mingled with exhaustion. What he wanted seemed simple enough: to make the ranch profitable, to expand his modest herd, to prove his father's faith in this harsh land hadn't been misplaced. What he refused to acknowledge was the emptiness that greeted him each night in the cabin, the conversations held only with his horse and cattle, the bone-deep loneliness that threatened to hollow him from within. "Talking to yourself again, Remington," the voice of Henry Blackwell, his nearest neighbor 3 miles downstream, startled Caleb from his thoughts. "Just reminding myself what needs doing," Caleb replied, turning to greet the older man who had appeared on horseback at the edge of the yard. "Something wrong, Henry. Rarely see you ride this way before noon." The gray-bearded rancher dismounted with a grunt. "Cavalry's coming through. Lieutenant asked me to spread word. Apache unrest down south has them jumpy. Nothing immediate to worry about, but thought you should know." Caleb nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Appreciate the warning, though it seems far from our concern up here." Henry spat into the snow. "War has a way of spilling where you least expect it. Anyway, got another piece of news might interest you more. Supply train coming through next week, bringing provisions, mail, and—" He paused with a knowing look, about a dozen women headed for Helena. "Widows mostly looking for a fresh start. Might consider cleaning yourself up, son." "The ranch keeps me busy enough without complications," Caleb replied stiffly. "Suit yourself," Henry chuckled, remounting his horse. But a man wasn't made to face these mountains alone forever. Even the most stubborn wolf eventually seeks a pack. After Henry departed, Caleb found himself unable to shake the conversation from his thoughts as he went about his chores. The possibility of company, of feminine presence in this masculine wilderness, stirred something in him he'd rather leave dormant. He'd seen too many frontier marriages crumble under the weight of isolation and hardship, his own parents included. His father had never been the same after his mother's passing, as though the better part of him had been buried alongside her. "That's not the life I'm building," he told his horse firmly as he saddled the chestnut gelding for his daily ride to check the herd. "Just me, the cattle, and enough profit to expand come spring. Nothing more complicated than that." The horse predictably offered no argument. 2 days later, as fresh snow blanketed the valley, Caleb's resolution was tested in a way he could never have anticipated. The sun had just begun its descent behind the western mountains when he spotted movement near the creek that bordered his property. Instinctively, his hand moved to the Winchester rifle mounted on his saddle as he guided his horse closer. The figure moved erratically through the snow, stumbling and rising again with determination. As Caleb drew nearer, he realized it was a young woman, dressed in a strange mixture of native clothing and what appeared to be a tattered calico dress. She collapsed again as he approached, this time remaining on her knees in the deepening snow. Caleb's practical mind immediately assessed potential threats. Was this a trap? Were there Apache warriors waiting to ambush a would-be rescuer? But the vast white landscape revealed no hiding places, no other tracks but her own. He dismounted cautiously, rifle in hand, and approached. "Miss, are you hurt?" When she raised her face to him, Caleb found himself momentarily speechless. Despite the smudges of dirt and exhaustion etching her features, her beauty was undeniable. She appeared to be around 20 years old, with striking features that suggested mixed heritage, high cheekbones and copper skin that spoke of native blood, but with eyes of such a deep blue they reminded him of mountain lakes in summer. Her jet-black hair hung in a long braid over one shoulder, adorned with a single feather. "Help," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Her eyes rolled back as she pitched forward into the snow. Caleb's rifle clattered beside him as he lunged to catch her before her face hit the ground. Up close, he could see the dried blood on her dress, the raw abrasions on her wrists suggesting she had been bound, and the fevered heat radiating from her skin despite the freezing temperature. Without further hesitation, Caleb lifted her slight form and carried her to his horse. Whatever dangers might follow this mysterious woman, he couldn't leave her to die in the snow. As he situated her before him in the saddle and wrapped his coat around her shivering body, Caleb couldn't help thinking that Henry's warning about complications had manifested far sooner than expected. The ride back to his cabin seemed interminable with the unconscious woman cradled against his chest. Her head rested against his shoulder, occasional whimpers escaping her lips when the horse's movement jostled her. By the time they reached the cabin, darkness had fallen completely, and Caleb had to work quickly to light the lamps and stoke the fire before tending to his unexpected guest. He laid her on his bed, the only one in the small two-room cabin, and assessed her condition more thoroughly. The blood on her dress appeared to come from a shallow wound on her side, likely from a knife or similar blade. Her feet were blistered and raw from what must have been miles of walking through rough terrain. Most concerning was the fever that flushed her cheeks and made her breathing shallow and rapid. Caleb gathered clean cloths, his limited medical supplies, and a basin of water. He hesitated before beginning to remove her dress, acutely aware of the impropriety, but the necessity of treating her wounds overcame his reluctance. "Forgive me, miss," he murmured as he carefully worked the tattered dress away from the wound on her side. As he cleaned and bandaged her injuries, questions multiplied in his mind. Who was she? How had she come to be wandering alone in Montana territory in the dead of winter? The mixture of native and settler clothing suggested a complicated story. Was she fleeing from someone? The marks on her wrists indicated as much. After tending to her wounds and changing her into one of his clean shirts, an act that caused him more discomfort than it seemed to cause her in her unconscious state, Caleb settled into the wooden chair beside the bed. Common sense told him to ride for the doctor in the morning, but the nearest physician was in Hamilton, a full day's ride in good weather. With snow falling heavily outside, it would be impossible to make the journey safely. "Looks like it's just us for now," he said quietly, more to fill the silence than anything else. "I've done what I can, rest is up to you." Throughout the night, Caleb dozed fitfully in the chair, waking every hour to check on his patient and replace the cool cloth on her forehead. Near dawn, her fever seemed to break, and her breathing became more regular. He was replacing the cloth when her eyes suddenly fluttered open, fixing on him with startling clarity. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice stronger than he expected but still hushed. "Caleb Remington. This is my ranch. I found you by the creek yesterday." He kept his voice gentle, afraid of frightening her. "You're safe now." She studied him for a long moment as though assessing the truth of his words. "Takala," she finally said. "My name is Takala Morningstar." "Takala," he repeated, the unfamiliar name feeling strange on his tongue. "That's Apache." She nodded slightly. "My mother was Apache, my father was a trader." Her eyes darted around the cabin. "Are you alone here?" "Yes," Caleb replied, then hastily added, "but my neighbor visits regularly. And the cavalry passes through these parts." He wasn't sure why he felt the need to mention potential witnesses, except perhaps to reassure her of her safety, or to remind himself of the propriety he needed to maintain. "Good," she whispered, her eyes already drifting closed again. "They might still be looking." Before Caleb could ask who they were, she had fallen back into slumber, this time appearing more peaceful than feverish. He sat back in his chair, studying her face in the pale morning light filtering through the window. The danger implied in her words should have alarmed him, should have made him regret his decision to bring a stranger, and possibly trouble, into his home. Instead, he found himself oddly protective of this mysterious woman who had literally collapsed at his feet. Perhaps it was nothing more than basic human decency, he told himself. He would have done the same for anyone in need. But as dawn broke fully over the Montana landscape, Caleb couldn't deny that Takala Morningstar had already disrupted the careful isolation he had built around himself, and some treacherous part of him didn't entirely mind. 3 days passed before Takala was strong enough to sit up and share her story. During that time, Caleb slept on a pallet by the fire, tended his necessary ranch chores as quickly as possible, and found himself increasingly drawn into conversation with his unusual guest. Her fever receded fully on the second day, revealing a sharp intelligence and quiet dignity that impressed him despite himself. "I was traveling north with my uncle's family," she explained as they shared a simple dinner of venison stew. "We sought to join relatives near the Canadian border, away from the conflicts further south. But we were attacked 2 weeks ago by men who claimed to be hunters." Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. "They were not hunters, they were traders in human lives. They killed the men in our party and took the women. My cousin and I were separated from the others. They kept us bound, moving north through back trails." Caleb's jaw tightened at the implications. He had heard whispers of such men, traffickers who kidnapped native women to sell in frontier towns or mining camps where women were scarce. The thought turned his stomach. "3 nights ago my cousin created a distraction. She told me to run while Takala's voice faltered. "I do not know if she survived. I ran until I could no longer stand, then walked when I could run no more. I was looking for the river that would lead to my relatives when you found me." Caleb absorbed this information gravely. "These men, how many were there?" "4 that I saw, perhaps more." Her blue eyes met his directly. "They will not stop looking, Mr. Remington. When the snow clears, I must continue north." "Call me Caleb," he said automatically, mind racing through implications. "And you're in no condition to travel anywhere yet. The wound in your side needs time to heal properly." What he didn't say was that the thought of her leaving already created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. In just 3 days, her presence had transformed his cabin from a lonely outpost to something that felt disturbingly like a home. The way she had arranged his few dishes more sensibly, the small decorative touches she'd added with pine branches and red berries, even the methodical way she folded his spare clothing, all spoke of a feminine influence his life had lacked since childhood. "I have imposed on your kindness too much already," Takala said softly, misreading his silence. "It's not an imposition," he replied quickly. "What I mean is, the snow's too deep for safe travel now anyway. You should stay until spring, at least." The offer surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise her. "Until spring," she echoed, studying him with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. "And what will your neighbors think, a single man housing an Apache woman through winter?" Caleb hadn't considered the gossip that would inevitably spread. Henry Blackwell was discreet, but others might not be. The territorial prejudices against natives ran deep, complicated further by the distant conflicts with various tribes. "We could say you're my cousin," he suggested, then immediately recognized how implausible that would sound given her appearance. "Or the hired housekeeper." A small smile curved her lips for the first time since he'd found her. "And will you pay me for these housekeeping duties?" The question caught him off guard, but her slight smile told him she wasn't entirely serious. Still, the practical considerations deserved addressing. "Room and board through winter, and enough money for your journey north in spring," he offered, feeling oddly like he was negotiating a business arrangement rather than offering shelter to someone in need. "In exchange for help around the cabin, it would give you time to heal properly and," he hesitated, "I admit the company wouldn't be unwelcome." Takala considered his proposal for a long moment. "I accept your terms, Caleb Remington," she finally said, extending her hand in a surprisingly formal gesture. "Until the spring thaw." As he took her hand to seal their arrangement, Caleb felt an inexplicable certainty that nothing about his carefully ordered existence would remain unchanged by spring. Word traveled quickly in the sparsely populated valley. Within a week of Takala's arrival, Henry Blackwell appeared at Caleb's door, ostensibly to deliver mail that had arrived on the supply train. "Heard you've taken in a stray," the older man said without preamble, eyes curious as he handed over the few letters addressed to Caleb. A housekeeper, Caleb corrected firmly, accepting the mail. Miss Morningstar needed employment, and I needed help with the cabin. Henry's bushy eyebrows rose skeptically. And the fact she's Apache. Half-Apache, Caleb replied, then immediately regretted the defensive note in his voice. Her father was a trader. She's educated, speaks English perfectly, and cooks better than either of us ever could. The rest is no one's concern. Henry studied him for a long moment before a slow smile spread beneath his gray beard. Well now, I never thought I'd see the day Caleb Remington got his back up defending a woman's honor. Must be some housekeeper. It's not like that, Caleb insisted, though the warmth creeping up his neck betrayed him. Course not, Henry agreed too easily, though you might want to prepare yourself. Church social next Sunday and folks will talk, some kindly, some not. After Henry departed, Caleb found Takala in the kitchen, pretending she hadn't been listening to every word. You heard, he asked unnecessarily. She nodded, focusing intently on the bread dough she was kneading. Perhaps this arrangement was unwise. I would not bring trouble to someone who has shown me kindness. It's no trouble, Caleb said, more firmly than intended. People will talk regardless of what we do. Best to give them as little ammunition as possible by keeping to ourselves. Takala looked up then, flour dusting her hands and a strand of black hair falling across her face. And the church social, will you attend? The question carried implications Caleb wasn't prepared to address. If he went alone, it would confirm he saw her as something to hide. If he invited her, it would place them both under scrutiny neither might welcome. Would you want to attend? He asked instead, surprising himself with the genuine interest in her answer. Something flickered in her eyes, vulnerability quickly masked. I have attended church with my father's family before, but I would understand if you preferred to go alone. No, Caleb said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. If you're feeling strong enough, we should go together. As employer and employee, he added hastily, it will establish your position here properly and stop any speculation. The smile that briefly illuminated her face made his heart perform an unexpected somersault in his chest. Then I shall need to finish the dress I've been mending, she said, returning her attention to the bread dough with renewed vigor. That night, as Caleb lay on his pallet by the fire, still insisting Takala take the bed until she was fully recovered, he contemplated the strange turn his life had taken. Just weeks ago, he had reaffirmed his commitment to solitude, convinced that emotional entanglements only led to pain in the unforgiving frontier. Now he found himself defending a half-Apache woman to his neighbors and contemplating escorting her to a church social. This changes nothing, he whispered to himself in the darkness. She'll be gone by spring. But even as he spoke the words, Caleb recognized the hollow ring of falsehood in them. Something fundamental had already changed within him, something he wasn't yet ready to name. Sunday dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing the landscape and transforming the weathered buildings of Hamilton into a picturesque winter scene. Caleb had spent the morning unusually preoccupied with his appearance, shaving with extra care and donning his seldom-worn Sunday suit, which felt stiff and constraining after years of practical ranch wear. When Takala emerged from the bedroom, however, all thoughts of his own discomfort vanished. She wore a simple dress of deep blue calico that she had painstakingly repaired and altered from the tattered garment she'd arrived in. Her black hair was arranged in a neat bun at the nape of her neck, with just a few tendrils framing her face. The color of the dress intensified the blue of her eyes, creating a striking contrast with her copper skin. Will this be acceptable? She asked, a rare note of uncertainty in her voice as she smoothed the fabric with her hands. Caleb realized he had been staring and quickly collected himself. More than acceptable. You look, he searched for a word that wouldn't cross the careful boundaries they had established. Very proper. The ride into town was largely silent, each lost in private thoughts about the reception that awaited them. As they approached the white-painted church at the edge of Hamilton, Caleb noticed Takala's posture stiffen slightly. We don't have to stay long, he assured her quietly as he helped her down from the wagon. Just long enough to be seen and exchange pleasantries. I am not afraid, she replied, though her hand lingered on his arm a moment longer than strictly necessary. I have faced worse than curious stares. The murmur of conversation inside the church dimmed noticeably as they entered. Caleb felt rather than saw the heads turning in their direction, the assessing glances, the whispered comments behind gloved hands. He resisted the urge to place a protective hand at Takala's back, aware that such a gesture would only fuel speculation. Reverend Thompson, a kindly man in his 60s with a refreshing lack of prejudice, approached them first. "Mr. Remington, what a pleasure to see you. It's been too long since you've joined us." His gaze shifted warmly to Takala. "And you've brought a guest. Welcome to our congregation, miss." "Morningstar," Takala supplied with a graceful nod. "Takala Morningstar. I am working as Mr. Remington's housekeeper through the winter." "Well, any friend of Caleb's is welcome here," the Reverend said, though Caleb didn't miss the flicker of understanding in the older man's eyes. "Please make yourselves comfortable. Service will begin shortly." As they moved toward an empty pew, Caleb became acutely aware of the range of reactions their presence elicited. Some faces showed open curiosity, others thinly veiled disapproval. Henry Blackwell offered a knowing wink from across the aisle, while his wife Martha studied Takala with undisguised interest. The most hostile glares came from Silas Jenkins and his sons, cattle ranchers from the south end of the valley known for their territorial disputes and harsh views on native peoples. Caleb had never had direct conflict with them, but knew their reputation for taking what they wanted and justifying it afterward. "The tall man with the gray beard keeps staring," Takala whispered as they took their seats. "Jenkins," Caleb replied under his breath, "best avoided. He's had run-ins with Apache raiding parties further south and holds grudges." The service itself passed without incident, though Caleb found his attention divided between the Reverend's sermon on Christian charity and the woman beside him. Takala followed the proceedings with respectful attention, her lips moving silently during prayers as though translating them into her mother's language. The real test came during the social hour afterward, held in the church basement where tables of food and hot coffee created a welcoming atmosphere despite the frigid temperatures outside. Caleb stayed close to Takala as they navigated the room, acutely aware of the protective instinct that had awakened in him. Martha Blackwell was the first to approach them directly, her round face alight with friendly curiosity as she extended a plate of cookies. "You must be the housekeeper Henry mentioned. I'm Martha Blackwell." Takala accepted a cookie with a smile. "Thank you. Yes, Mr. Remington has kindly employed me through the winter." "And where are you from originally, dear?" Martha asked, the question innocent enough on its surface. "My father traded along the southern territories," Takala replied smoothly, the practiced answer revealing little. "After his passing, I sought honest work northward." Martha nodded sympathetically. "Well, you found a good employer in young Remington here, despite his tendency toward hermit-like behavior." She turned to Caleb with a teasing smile. "Perhaps having someone to look after will civilize you a bit." Before Caleb could formulate a response, a shadow fell across their small group. Silas Jenkins loomed over them, his weathered face set in lines of disapproval. "Remington," he acknowledged curtly before his gaze shifted deliberately to Takala. "Interesting choice of help you've hired." The emphasis he placed on the word help carried unmistakable insinuation. Caleb felt his jaw tighten as anger flared in his chest. "Miss Morningstar is an excellent housekeeper," he replied evenly, struggling to maintain a civil tone. "I consider myself fortunate to have found such capable assistants." Jenkins' mouth twisted in an unpleasant smile. "I'm sure you do, though some might wonder about a young man living alone with a housekeeper, especially one of her particular heritage." Martha Blackwell drew herself up indignantly. "Silas Jenkins, I'm shocked at your implication, Mr. Remington's arrangements are his own business. When those arrangements involve bringing Apache into our community, it becomes everyone's business," Jenkins retorted, voice rising enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. "Those savages have been raiding settlements all through the territories. For all we know, she could be a spy." Caleb stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Jenkins and Takala. "That's enough, Jenkins. Miss Morningstar is half-Apache, was raised by her trader father, and has done nothing to deserve your suspicion or disrespect." The tension in the church basement had become palpable, conversations dying away as people turned to watch the confrontation. Caleb was acutely aware of Takala beside him, her posture rigid but her expression carefully composed. "I meant no disrespect," Jenkins said with mock innocence. Simply expressing concern for community safety, times being what they are. Your concern is noted, Caleb replied coldly. Now if you'll excuse us, we should be heading back. Storm clouds gathering. As they made their way toward the door, Caleb felt Takala's hand slip into his, a gesture that seemed born of both vulnerability and defiance. He squeezed her fingers reassuringly, not caring in that moment what additional gossip the action might generate. The ride home began in tense silence, the confrontation with Jenkins hanging between them. Snow had indeed begun to fall, large flakes drifting lazily from a steel-gray sky. "I am sorry," Takala finally said as the church spire disappeared behind them. "I have brought trouble to your door." Caleb shook his head firmly. "Jenkins is the trouble, not you. He's been looking for reasons to dislike me since I refused to sell him grazing rights last spring. You're just a convenient excuse." She studied him for a long moment, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes. "You defended me. Not many white men would stand against their own kind for an Apache woman." "I defended what was right," Caleb said, though even as the words left his mouth, he recognized they weren't entirely true. He had defended her, Takala specifically, with an intensity that surprised even himself. "Besides, Jenkins doesn't speak for everyone. Reverend Thompson welcomed you, and so did the Blackwells. Still, perhaps it would be best if I remained at the ranch for future Sundays," she suggested quietly. "Less complicated for you." Something in her tone made Caleb pull the wagon to a halt. He turned to face her fully, snow gathering on the brim of his hat as he sought the right words. "I won't hide you away as though I'm ashamed," he said with unexpected fierceness. "You've done nothing wrong, and neither have I. If people choose to gossip or judge, that's their failing, not ours." Takala's eyes widened slightly at his vehemence. "You are not what I expected, Caleb Remington." "What did you expect?" he asked, curious despite himself. A small smile curved her lips. "When you found me, I thought you were like other frontier men I have encountered, guarded, practical, perhaps kind, but ultimately concerned only with your own interests." She paused, snowflakes melting on her cheeks like tears. "I am discovering there is more beneath the surface." Before Caleb could respond to this observation that hit uncomfortably close to home, a distant sound drew his attention. Hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching from the direction they had come. "Jenkins and his sons," he muttered, recognizing the lead rider even at a distance. "What does he want now?" "Nothing good," Takala replied, tension returning to her voice. "Perhaps we should hurry home." Caleb flicked the reins, urging the horses to a faster pace despite the increasingly treacherous conditions. The snow was falling more heavily now, limiting visibility and making the track slippery. Behind them, the riders continued their pursuit. "They're gaining," Takala said, glancing over her shoulder. "Caleb, if they mean harm." "They won't try anything too brazen," he reassured her, though his hand instinctively checked the rifle secured beneath the seat. "Not without justification they can sell to the community." His prediction proved optimistic. As Jenkins and his three sons pulled alongside the wagon, the patriarch's expression held none of the false civility he had shown at the church. "Thought we might have a proper talk, Remington," he called over the creak of wagon wheels and the thud of hooves. "About your house guest." "Nothing to discuss, Jenkins," Caleb replied, keeping his focus on the snowy track ahead. "Miss Morningstar works for me, that's all there is to it." Jenkins laughed, an ugly sound that carried on the winter air. "That what you're calling it, work, because word is she's been living in your cabin for weeks now." "Mighty convenient arrangement." Caleb felt Takala stiffen beside him, but kept his own expression neutral. "Your interest in my household affairs is noted and unwelcome. Now if you'll excuse us, we'd like to reach home before this snow gets worse." "Not so fast," Jenkins said, maneuvering his horse directly in front of the wagon and forcing Caleb to pull hard on the reins. The wagon slid slightly before coming to a halt, horses snorting nervously in the growing storm. Jenkins' sons circled around, effectively surrounding them on the narrow track. One of them, Ethan, a burly man in his early 30s with his father's mean eyes, leaned toward the wagon. "Way I see it, harboring Apache during these troubled times raises questions," he drawled. "Military might be interested to know about it." "I am not a fugitive," Takala spoke for the first time, her voice calm despite the dangerous situation. "I have broken no laws." "Your kind broke plenty," the youngest Jenkins' son spat. "Raided settlements, killed settlers. Maybe you were part of it." Caleb's patience snapped. He reached beneath the seat and brought the Winchester into view, not aiming it but making its presence clear. "That's enough. Back away from my wagon and let us pass." A tense silence fell, broken only by the soft hiss of snow and the occasional stamp of a nervous horse. Silas Jenkins' eyes narrowed as he assessed the determination in Caleb's expression. "This isn't over, Remington," he finally said, gesturing for his sons to move aside. "That Apache woman doesn't belong here, and one way or another she'll be gone before spring." "That's not for you to decide," Caleb replied evenly, never taking his eyes off the older man. As the Jenkins family reluctantly gave way, allowing the wagon to continue its journey, Caleb felt a new weight settle on his shoulders. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, taking in an injured traveler, had escalated into something that threatened not just his standing in the community, but potentially Takala's safety. The storm intensified as they made their way home, the snow falling so thickly that the familiar landscape became alien and treacherous. By the time they reached the cabin, both were chilled to the bone and exhausted from the tension of the confrontation. Inside, as Takala built up the fire and Caleb cared for the horses, neither spoke of what had transpired. Yet something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained, employer and employee, rescuer and rescued, had been replaced by something more complex. Allies against a common threat, two souls finding unexpected connection in a hostile world. As they shared a simple dinner that evening, Caleb finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "Jenkins won't let this rest. He's held a grudge against Apache since losing a brother to a raid years back. Now he's fixed on you as a target for that hate." Takala met his gaze steadily across the table. "I could leave, make my way north as planned." "In winter." Alone, Caleb shook his head firmly. "That's not an option. Jenkins and his sons would likely track you, claiming they suspected you of something, and even if they didn't, the weather alone would." He couldn't bring himself to finish the thought. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked softly. Caleb considered his next words carefully, aware they would cross a line from which there would be no easy return. "We stand our ground together. Jenkins can spread his poison, but he can't force you from my property without breaking the law himself. And if he tries," his hand tightened around his coffee cup, "well, he'll find I'm not easily intimidated." Takala studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her blue eyes. "Why would you risk this, Caleb? You're standing in the community, possibly even your safety, for someone you barely know." The question caught him off guard with its directness. Why indeed? The practical, self-preserving part of him that had governed his life since his father's death had no ready answer. Yet some newer, more vulnerable part of him seemed to recognize a truth he wasn't fully ready to acknowledge. "I know enough," he finally said. "I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you've faced hardship without letting it break your spirit. I know you deserve better than what men like Jenkins would give you." He paused, finding unexpected difficulty continuing. "And I know that these past weeks with you here. The cabin feels different, less empty." The last admission cost him something to voice aloud, an acknowledgement of the loneliness he had denied for so long. To his surprise, Takala reached across the table and placed her hand atop his, the touch sending an unexpected warmth through him. "Then I will stay," she said simply, "and we will face whatever comes together." As the winter deepened, transforming the Montana landscape into a frozen wonderland, life at the Remington Ranch fell into a rhythm neither Caleb nor Takala had anticipated. The predicted backlash from the Jenkins confrontation materialized in small ways. Merchants in town becoming suddenly less friendly, invitations to community gatherings drying up, occasional threatening tracks circling the property that Caleb pretended not to notice to avoid alarming Takala. Yet within their isolated world, something unexpected flourished. Takala's presence transformed the Spartan cabin into a home through small touches, dried wildflowers preserved from before the snow, arrangements of pine boughs that filled the rooms with a fresh scent, curtains fashioned from spare fabric that softened the harsh lines of the windows. More significant was the transformation in Caleb himself, a gradual thawing of the careful reserve he had maintained for years. Evening conversations stretched longer by the fire, ranging from practical discussions of ranch management to deeper exchanges about their pasts. Caleb found himself sharing memories he had locked away, his mother's smile, his father's patient teachings, the devastating loneliness that had followed their deaths. Takala spoke of her own divided heritage, an Apache mother who had fallen in love with a kind-eyed trader, the struggles of belonging to two worlds while being fully accepted by neither. "My father wanted me educated in both traditions," she explained one evening as she worked intricate beadwork onto a piece of leather. "He taught me to read English books by lantern light, while my mother showed me how to track game and read the stars. When others called me half-breed, he said I was twice blessed instead." Caleb watched her nimble fingers work the tiny beads into a floral pattern. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," she agreed, a shadow crossing her face. "Until fever took both my parents 3 winters ago. After that, I lived with my mother's people but never fully belonged. When tensions increased with settlers, my uncle decided we should move north, away from the conflicts." Her hands stilled. "You know what happened then?" Caleb had grown to recognize the subtle signs of distress she tried to hide, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her breathing became more measured and controlled. Without thinking, he reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for all of it, for what those men did, for Jenkins. For a world that makes you choose between heritages instead of honoring both." She looked up at him then, surprise and something deeper reflected in her eyes. "Most white men would say I should be grateful for my father's blood, that it makes me more than my mother's people." "I'm not most men," Caleb replied, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised even himself. "No," she agreed softly, "you are not." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities, until Takala gently withdrew her hand and returned to her beadwork. Yet something had shifted, a boundary crossed that could not be reestablished. That night, as Caleb lay on his pallet by the fire, a arrangement he had stubbornly maintained despite Takala's insistence that she could take the floor now that she had fully recovered, he confronted the truth he had been avoiding for weeks. His feelings for Takala had grown beyond the boundaries of employer and employee, rescuer and rescued, even beyond simple friendship. He found himself noticing details he had no business observing, the graceful arc of her neck as she bent over her sewing, the musical quality of her rare laughter, the intelligence that shone in her eyes when she spoke of things that mattered to her. "This cannot happen," he whispered to himself in the darkness. "She'll be gone by spring." But the thought of her departure, once a reassuring reminder of the temporary nature of their arrangement, now filled him with a hollow ache he couldn't ignore. January blurred into February, bringing the harshest weather of the winter. Blizzards howled around the cabin, forcing them into closer quarters than ever as they conserved firewood and oil for the lamps. On the coldest nights, Caleb insisted Takala take his bed near the fireplace while he slept in the kitchen, checking periodically to ensure the fire didn't die completely. During one such storm, with wind shrieking like banshees around the eaves, Caleb woke from fitful sleep to find Takala standing in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in a quilt. "I heard you moving about," she explained, her voice barely audible above the storm. "You should not have to sleep in the cold while I take the warm room." "I'm fine," he insisted, though he couldn't prevent a slight shiver that belied his words. Takala studied him for a moment, then made a decision that visibly played across her expressive features. "There is another solution, one my people would find sensible, though yours might not." She hesitated, then continued with quiet dignity. "The bed is large enough for two, with proper space between. We would both be warmer, and you would not sacrifice your comfort for mine." Caleb stared at her, certain he had misheard. "That wouldn't be appropriate." "Is propriety worth freezing for?" she asked practically. "We are two adults in a survival situation. Nothing more need be implied." The practical part of his brain recognized the sense in her suggestion. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the temperature in the kitchen had dropped dangerously low despite his efforts to maintain the fire. Still, the thought of sharing such intimate space with Takala awakened possibilities he had been struggling to suppress. "I gave you my word you would be safe here," he said finally. "What would you think of me if I agreed to such an arrangement?" Something like disappointment flickered in her eyes. I would think you a practical man who values survival over meaningless convention. But I will not insist. She turned to go, then paused. My people believe intentions matter more than appearances, Caleb. I trust your intentions. With that, she disappeared back into the main room, leaving Caleb torn between propriety and common sense. After another hour of shivering in the increasingly frigid kitchen, common sense prevailed. He entered the main room cautiously, finding Takala awake, staring into the fire's dying embers. If the offer still stands, he said quietly, I accept. Without a word, she moved to one side of the bed, leaving ample space between them. Caleb lay down stiffly on the other side, careful to keep the quilt as a barrier between them. For several long minutes they lay in awkward silence, the howling storm and crackling fire the only sounds in the small cabin. Thank you, Takala finally whispered into the darkness, for trusting me as I trust you. Always, Caleb replied, the word emerging with unexpected tenderness. Eventually, exhaustion overcame discomfort, and Caleb drifted into sleep, more peaceful than any he had known in years. When he woke hours later, he found they had gravitated toward each other in sleep, Takala's head resting against his shoulder, his arm curved protectively around her. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still, absorbing the rightness of her weight against him, the gentle rhythm of her breathing. Reality intruded with the cold light of dawn. Carefully, Caleb disentangled himself and rose from the bed before Takala woke, unwilling to embarrass her with the knowledge of their unconscious seeking of each other's warmth. Yet as he built up the morning fire, he couldn't deny that something fundamental had changed within him during the night. The careful walls he had constructed around his heart had developed cracks that could not be repaired. The storm raged for 3 more days, forcing them to continue the shared sleeping arrangement with decreasing awkwardness and increasing comfort. Neither spoke of it during daylight hours, treating it as a practical necessity rather than a choice with deeper implications. Yet Caleb found himself looking forward to nightfall with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years, to the quiet conversations in the firelight before sleep claimed them, to the simple comfort of another's presence in the darkness. When the storm finally broke, revealing a transformed landscape of massive snowdrifts and ice-crusted trees glittering in the sun, Caleb faced the prospect of returning to his pallet by the fire with unexpected reluctance. That evening, after they had finished clearing paths to the barn and checking on the animals, an awkward tension hung between them as bedtime approached. The temperature has risen considerably, Takala observed, needlessly rearranging items on the small shelf by the fire. You should be comfortable in your usual place now. Yes, Caleb agreed, though the word felt hollow in his mouth. I suppose that's best. She nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. Good night, then. As she turned toward the bed, Caleb found himself speaking without conscious decision. Takala, wait. She paused, looking back at him with a question in her eyes. These past days, he began, then faltered, struggling to find words for feelings he had denied even to himself. Having you here it's been, I've realized. Before he could continue, a sharp crack shattered the stillness of the evening, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot, followed by the splintering of wood as a bullet embedded itself in the cabin wall. Instinct took over. Caleb lunged forward, pulling Takala to the floor as a second shot punched through the window, sending glass spraying across the room. Stay down, he ordered, reaching for his own rifle propped by the door. Crawl to the back room. Heart pounding, he crouched below the windows, straining to hear movement outside. The attack wasn't entirely unexpected. He had sensed Jenkins' growing hostility with each passing week, but the brazenness of firing directly at the cabin shocked him. Such an act crossed the line from intimidation to attempted murder. Remington, a voice called from the darkness, send out the Apache woman and we'll be on our way. No need for things to get messier than they already are. Ethan Jenkins. Caleb recognized the voice immediately, wondering if the son acted with his father's knowledge or on his own initiative. Go to hell, Jenkins, Caleb shouted back, keeping low as he moved to a position with a better view of the yard. You're trespassing on my property and firing on my home. The law won't look kindly on that. A harsh laugh answered him. Law's a long way off, Remington. By the time the marshal rides out from Hamilton, this could all be over. One dead Apache won't raise many eyebrows these days. Cold rage filled Caleb at the casual threat to Takala's life. "There'll be more than one body if you don't clear out," he warned, his voice deadly calm despite the fear churning in his gut. "I've got a clear shot at your voice." Silence fell for several long moments. Caleb used the opportunity to check on Takala, who had moved to the back room as instructed but now crouched with a pistol in her hands, his backup revolver that he kept in the bedside drawer. Her face was calm, focused in a way that reminded him she was not just a woman in distress but a survivor who had faced danger before. "You're making a mistake, Remington," Ethan called again, his voice coming from a slightly different position. He was moving, trying to find a better angle. "That Apache witch has clouded your thinking. What would your father say, seeing you throw away your standing in the community for a savage?" The mention of his father struck a nerve, but not in the way Ethan intended. William Remington had been a fair man who judged people by their actions rather than their heritage. He would have admired Takala's courage and resilience as much as Caleb did. "My father would say a man who fires on another's home in the night is the real savage," Caleb replied, eyes scanning the moonlit yard for movement. "Last warning, Jenkins. Leave now or face the consequences." The answer came in the form of another shot, this one splintering the doorframe inches from Caleb's head. He returned fire immediately, aiming at the flash he'd glimpsed from behind the water trough. A cry of pain told him his bullet had found its mark. "You shot me." Ethan's voice was high with shock and pain. "You actually shot me." "Warned you," Caleb called back, reloading quickly. "Next one won't be in your arm, now get off my land." The sound of retreating hoofbeats suggested Ethan had decided to heed the warning, at least temporarily. Still, Caleb maintained his vigilant position for another hour, unwilling to risk letting down his guard too soon. When he finally felt certain the danger had passed for the night, he found Takala still in the back room, pistol ready, watching the window with unwavering attention. "He's gone," Caleb said quietly, "for now." She nodded, slowly lowering the gun. "He will return with his father and brothers next time." "I know." Caleb sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted as the adrenaline drained from his system. "This has gone beyond threats now. They won't stop until—" He couldn't finish the thought. Takala sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Until I am gone," she completed softly. "Or dead." "I won't let that happen," Caleb said fiercely, turning to face her. In the dim light, her eyes held a sadness that twisted something in his chest. "Perhaps I should leave after all," she suggested, though the words lacked conviction. "Find my way north as planned. And if they follow, hunt you down in the wilderness with no one to witness." Caleb shook his head firmly. "No, we need a more permanent solution." "What solution exists?" "The Jenkins family has influence here. Even if you reported tonight's attack, would the local law take action against them on the word of a rancher defending an Apache woman?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Caleb knew she was right. Frontier justice often bent toward those with the deepest roots and loudest voices in a community. The Jenkins family had been in the valley for 20 years, while Caleb was still considered something of a newcomer despite inheriting his father's ranch. "We have one advantage," he said finally. "Jenkins shot first in the dark at an occupied home. That crosses a line even his friends can't easily defend, and I have physical evidence, bullet holes in my cabin and window." "Is it enough?" Takala asked, doubt evident in her voice. "It has to be," Caleb replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "First thing tomorrow, I'll ride to Hamilton and speak with Marshal Davis. He's a fair man, even if he's friendly with the Jenkins family." Takala studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the shadows. "You would risk everything, your ranch, your standing, perhaps even your life, for my safety." The question laid bare the heart of the matter, forcing Caleb to confront feelings he had been avoiding for weeks. With surprising clarity, he realized the answer had been forming within him since the day he found her stumbling through the snow. "Yes," he said simply, "I would." Something shifted in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the weight those two syllables carried. Slowly, as if giving him time to pull away, Takala raised her hand to his cheek. The gentle touch sent warmth spreading through him, melting the last of his careful reserve. "Why?" she whispered, though the question seemed more ritual than genuine inquiry. Instead of answering with words, Caleb closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened into something that expressed all he couldn't articulate: his fear for her safety, his admiration for her strength, and the unexpected love that had taken root in his heart despite all his efforts to remain detached. When they finally parted, breathless and stunned by the intensity of the connection, Takala rested her forehead against his. "I did not expect this," she murmured. "When you found me dying in the snow, I could not have imagined." "Nor I," Caleb admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I wanted solitude, needed it even. But now the thought of returning to that life, without you, is unbearable." She drew back slightly, searching his face in the dim light. "What are you saying, Caleb?" The question demanded complete honesty, something Caleb had avoided even with himself until this moment. "I'm saying I love you," he answered, the words simpler than he had expected. "And I want you to stay, not as my housekeeper, not just until spring, but as my wife if you'll have me." The bold declaration surprised them both. Marriage between white settlers and natives, while not unheard of on the frontier, often faced significant prejudice and practical challenges. By making such an offer, Caleb was choosing a path that would permanently alter his standing in the community and possibly create ongoing danger from men like Jenkins. Takala's silence stretched long enough that doubt began to creep into Caleb's mind. Had he misread her feelings, spoken too soon, offered something she couldn't accept? "Before you answer," he said quickly, "I know what I'm asking. I know it won't be easy. People will talk, some will shun us, others may try to harm us. But I believe what we could build together would be worth facing all of that." Takala placed her fingers gently against his lips, stopping his nervous flow of words. "In my mother's tradition," she said softly, "a woman who accepts a man's offer of marriage must believe three things: that he is brave enough to protect their family, wise enough to make good decisions, and kind enough to treat her with respect." A small smile curved her lips. "I have seen all three in you, Caleb Remington." Hope bloomed in his chest. "Is that a yes?" "It is," she confirmed, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "But we must be certain. The path will not be easy." Caleb gathered her hands in his, overwhelmed by the certainty that had replaced his earlier doubts. "No worthwhile path ever is, but we'll face it together." As dawn approached, they remained awake, planning their next steps. The immediate threat from Jenkins would need addressing. Caleb would ride to Hamilton as planned to report the night's attack to Marshal Davis. Beyond that, they would need to consider how and where to build their life together. Reverend Thompson might be willing to perform the ceremony despite community objections, given his progressive views. But would they remain in the valley afterward, facing ongoing hostility, or seek a fresh start elsewhere, perhaps closer to Takala's northern relatives? "One day at a time," Caleb finally said as the first light of dawn filtered through the bullet-shattered window. "First we ensure our safety, then we build our future." Takala nodded, her head resting against his shoulder as exhaustion finally began to claim them both, together. As they drifted toward sleep in the growing light, Caleb reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. From a lonely rancher convinced that isolation was his destiny to a man willing to challenge convention and prejudice for love, the transformation seemed both impossible and inevitable. The frontier that he had once viewed as a place unsuited for tender emotions had, paradoxically, brought him the deepest connection he had ever known. With Takala's warmth beside him and the promise of a shared future ahead, Caleb finally understood what his father had tried to tell him years ago: that even in the harshest landscapes, the human heart could find its home in another's keeping. Marshal Davis arrived at the Remington ranch the following afternoon, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the bullet holes in the cabin's exterior. The overnight snow had covered any tracks, but the evidence of the attack remained clear in the splintered wood and shattered window. "This is serious business, Caleb," the lawman said, running his finger along a bullet's path through the doorframe. "Firing on an occupied dwelling at night, that's attempted murder any way you slice it." "Will you arrest Jenkins?" Caleb asked directly, standing protectively near Takala, who had remained silent but watchful during the marshal's inspection. Davis sighed heavily. "It's not that simple. You say it was Ethan Jenkins, but did you actually see him, in the dark?" "I recognized his voice," Caleb insisted, "and I wounded him, his arm or shoulder." "He'll have a fresh bullet wound to explain." That helps, Davis acknowledged, but the Jenkins family will claim self-defense or some such nonsense. Silas has friends on the territorial council. It complicates matters, his gaze shifted to Takala, especially given the circumstances. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. You mean because Takala is Apache, does that make her life worth less under the law? The marshal had the grace to look uncomfortable. Of course not to me anyway, but I can't pretend it won't factor into how others view the situation. He studied them both for a moment. Word around town is you two have become close. That true? The direct question caught Caleb off guard, but he saw no point in denial. Yes, in fact, we intend to marry. Takala has accepted my proposal. Davis's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Well, now that changes things considerably. Not in a legal sense, he hastened to add, but it certainly clarifies Jenkins' motivation. This wasn't just harassment, it was meant to prevent a marriage he finds objectionable. Will that make a difference in how you proceed? Takala asked, speaking for the first time since the marshal's arrival. Davis considered her question carefully. It might. Attempted murder is one thing. Trying to prevent a legal marriage between consenting adults is another kind of interference entirely. He turned back to Caleb. I'll ride out to the Jenkins place today, question Ethan about his whereabouts, and that wound he's likely nursing. Can't promise an arrest yet, but I can put them on notice that I'm watching. It wasn't the decisive action Caleb had hoped for, but he recognized it as the most the marshal could realistically offer given the social and political realities of the territory. Thank you, Marshal, he said, extending his hand. We appreciate you taking this seriously. Davis shook the offered hand firmly. I've known you since you were a boy, Caleb. Your father was a good man who treated everyone fairly. I suspect you've chosen a wife who shares those values. He nodded respectfully to Takala. I wish you both happiness, though I can't promise it'll be an easy road. After the marshal departed, Caleb and Takala sat at the kitchen table, considering their next steps. The investigation would buy them some time, but both recognized that a more permanent solution would be necessary for their safety and future happiness. We should speak with Reverend Thompson, Takala suggested. If he is willing to perform our marriage ceremony, it would give us legal protection that might deter further attacks. Caleb agreed, though concerns still weighed heavily on him. Even with the law and the church on our side, the Jenkins family won't easily accept our union. And they're not the only ones who might object. You are having second thoughts, Takala asked, a vulnerability in her voice that made Caleb's heart ache. Never about you, he assured her quickly, taking her hands in his. Only about whether we can build a life here, surrounded by such hostility. Perhaps we should consider leaving after the wedding, starting fresh somewhere people don't know us or care about our different heritages. Takala considered this possibility thoughtfully. My mother's people believe that running from a threat only encourages the pursuer. The Jenkins family threatened what is yours, your land, your home, your choice of wife. If we flee, they win more than they deserve. Her quiet strength reinforced Caleb's own resolve. You're right. This land was my father's dream, and now it's mine, ours, if you're willing to make it so. We shouldn't surrender it to bullies and bigots. Then we stay, Takala said simply, and face whatever comes together. The following Sunday, Caleb and Takala returned to the church in Hamilton, this time with a specific purpose beyond attending services. The congregation's reaction to their arrival was mixed. Some offered cautious smiles, others deliberately looked away, and a few, including Martha Blackwell, approached with genuine warmth. I heard about the trouble at your ranch, Martha said in a hushed voice. Disgraceful behavior. Henry says the marshal questioned Ethan Jenkins about a suspicious wound, but of course the entire family claims he injured himself while repairing a fence. Of course they do, Caleb replied, unsurprised by the predictable alibi. Martha patted Takala's arm sympathetically. Well, not everyone shares their views, dear. Some of us judge people by their character rather than their bloodline. After the service, Caleb and Takala requested a private meeting with Reverend Thompson. In the small office behind the church, they formally asked him to perform their marriage ceremony. The elderly preacher listened thoughtfully to their request, his kind eyes assessing them both before responding. Marriage is not a commitment to be entered into lightly, he began, especially a union that will face particular challenges from the community. We understand the difficulties, Caleb assured him, and we're prepared to face them together. Thompson nodded slowly. I believe you are. I've watched you both these past Sundays, the way you support each other, the respect evident between you. He smiled at Takala. And I've noticed how this young man's demeanor has changed since you entered his life, Miss Morningstar. There's a light in him now that was absent before. Takala returned the smile, her hand finding Caleb's. He has brought light to my life as well, Reverend. Then I would be honored to perform your ceremony, Thompson declared, though I suggest we conduct it soon given the tensions that exist. Perhaps next Sunday after regular services, those who wish to witness and support your union may remain, while others are free to depart. The arrangement seemed sensible, offering a compromise that acknowledged both their right to marry and the community's divided feelings about their union. With the date set for the following Sunday, Caleb and Takala left the church with renewed hope for their future, despite the challenges that still lay ahead. The news of their impending marriage spread quickly through the valley, generating reactions that ranged from surprised acceptance to outright condemnation. Henry Blackwell rode out to the ranch midweek, bringing not only his and Martha's good wishes but also a warning. Jenkins is fuming, the older man reported as they shared coffee at Caleb's kitchen table. Been ranting in town about race mixing and betrayal of pioneer values. Nasty stuff. Marshal Davis has warned him to keep his distance from your property, but I'd stay vigilant if I were you. We are, Caleb assured him, indicating the rifle he now kept constantly within reach. But we won't let threats stop us from building our life together. Henry nodded approvingly. Good, too many folks let fear guide their choices out here. Takes courage to follow your heart instead. He turned to Takala with genuine curiosity. Will you be wearing traditional Apache dress for the ceremony? Martha's been wondering. Takala smiled at the unexpected question. I plan to honor both sides of my heritage. My mother's traditional jewelry with a dress in the settler style. Martha will be pleased to hear it, Henry said, rising to take his leave. She's organizing some of the church ladies to prepare refreshments after the ceremony. Not everyone's against you, remember that. The unexpected support touched them both deeply. That evening, as they sat by the fire discussing final preparations for their wedding, Takala worked on beating a new dress while Caleb carved a simple wooden ring as a temporary token, until he could purchase proper wedding bands on their next trip to Missoula. It seems we have more friends than I realized, Caleb observed, carefully smoothing the inner surface of the wooden band. People often surprise you when given the chance, Takala replied. My father used to say that for every person who hates without reason, there are two more who love without condition. We just notice the hatred more because it shouts while love whispers. Caleb paused in his carving, struck by the wisdom in her words. Your father sounds like a man I would have respected greatly. He would have approved of you, she said softly. He believed in building bridges between worlds rather than walls. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of approaching riders, multiple horses moving at speed toward the cabin. Caleb was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window with practiced caution. 4 riders, he reported tensely, coming fast, can't make out who in the darkness. Takala joined him at the window, her own expression alert but calm. Jenkins and his sons. Possibly, Caleb checked that the rifle was loaded, then positioned himself near the door. Stay back, away from the windows. Instead, Takala moved to the kitchen and returned with his pistol, checking its chambers with practiced ease. I will not cower while you face danger alone, she said firmly. We defend our home together. The determination in her voice left no room for argument, and Caleb felt a surge of pride, even as fear for her safety tightened his chest. They positioned themselves on either side of the main room, covering both the front door and windows, and waited as the riders drew nearer. To their mutual surprise, a familiar voice called out before the riders reached the cabin. Caleb Remington, it's Marshal Davis. Don't shoot, we're coming in friendly. Relief flooded through Caleb as he recognized the marshal's voice. Lowering his rifle slightly, he moved to the door and called back, That's close enough, Marshal. What brings you out here at this hour? Important news, Davis replied, and an extra patrol. Can we come up to the house? After a cautious assessment of the riders, confirming the marshal and 3 deputies, Caleb allowed them to approach. Davis dismounted heavily, his expression grave as he declined Caleb's invitation to enter the cabin. "Best we talk out here," the lawman said, glancing at Takala, who had joined them on the porch. "Got word this afternoon that Silas Jenkins and his boys are planning something. One of the saloon girls overheard them drinking and talking about stopping the marriage by any means necessary." Cold dread settled in Caleb's stomach. "When?" "That's just it, we don't know. Could be tonight, could be Sunday at the church. That's why I've assigned deputies to patrol your property through the weekend." Davis gestured to the men who remained mounted. "They'll rotate shifts, keep an eye out for trouble." Takala stepped forward, her calm presence a stark contrast to the tension of the moment. "Thank you, Marshal. This is more than we expected." Davis removed his hat briefly in acknowledgement. "As I told Caleb before, Miss Morningstar, the law applies equally to all, regardless of heritage. Jenkins has no right to threaten you or interfere with a legal marriage." He replaced his hat, his expression hardening. "Besides, I've never much cared for Silas Jenkins. Man's been pushing the boundaries of the law for years, thinking his money and connections protect him." After establishing a patrol schedule with the deputies, Davis departed with assurances that he would personally ensure security at the church on Sunday. The protection eased some of Caleb's immediate concerns, though he maintained a watchful vigilance throughout the night, unwilling to fully trust their safety to others. As dawn broke, bringing with it a pristine blanket of fresh snow that transformed the landscape into a glistening wonderland, Caleb found Takala already awake, standing by the window with a contemplative expression. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked quietly, moving to stand beside her. "About the wedding, about us? I would understand if recent events have made you reconsider." She turned to him, her blue eyes clear and certain. "No. The threats only strengthen my resolve. I will not allow fear to dictate my choices." She reached up to touch his face gently. "But I worry for you. The consequences of loving me are heavier than either of us anticipated." Caleb caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Worth every ounce," he assured her. "I spent years believing the frontier was no place for love. That attachment only led to pain when the harsh realities of this life inevitably took their toll. But these past months with you have taught me something different." "What is that?" she asked softly. "That facing the harshness together makes it bearable, more than bearable, meaningful." He drew her closer, resting his forehead against hers. "I don't regret a single moment, Takala, not one." The days leading to Sunday passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and vigilance. The deputies maintained their patrols as promised, and no sign of the Jenkins family appeared on or near the Remington property. This absence of threat should have been reassuring, but instead it created a mounting tension, like the stillness before a storm. On Sunday morning, Caleb and Takala prepared for both their wedding and whatever confrontation might await them. Beneath her carefully altered dress of pale blue calico, Takala wore the traditional beaded necklace that had belonged to her mother, a striking combination of her dual heritage. Caleb dressed in his best suit, the wooden ring he had carved tucked safely in his pocket alongside his father's pocket watch. "Ready?" he asked as they prepared to leave for the church. Takala nodded, her expression serene despite the circumstances. "I have waited my whole life to find where I truly belong. Today, I know it is with you." The ride to Hamilton was accompanied by 2 deputies, with Marshal Davis waiting to meet them at the church. The building was already filled with the regular Sunday congregation when they arrived, creating a moment of acute self-consciousness as they entered together, aware of the many eyes tracking their progress down the aisle. Reverend Thompson greeted them warmly, proceeding with the regular service as planned. When the final hymn concluded, he announced, "Those who wish to witness the marriage of Caleb Remington and Takala Morningstar are welcome to remain. Those who must depart go with God's blessing." The congregation's response revealed the community's divided feelings. Approximately half chose to leave, some with pointed looks of disapproval, others simply uncomfortable with the unconventional union. Yet Caleb found himself focusing not on those who left but on those who stayed. The Blackwells, several neighboring ranchers and their families, a few shopkeepers from town, and even some elderly women Caleb barely knew who smiled encouragingly at Takala. As they moved to the front of the church to begin the ceremony, the doors at the back suddenly burst open with a bang that echoed through the small building. Silas Jenkins stood framed in the doorway, his sons flanking him, all 4 men visibly armed. "This abomination will not proceed," Jenkins announced loudly, his voice slurring slightly, evidence of liquid courage consumed before this confrontation. "No God-fearing community should allow a white man to marry an Apache witch." Marshal Davis moved swiftly to intercept the intruders, his deputies closing ranks beside him. "That's far enough, Jenkins. You're disturbing a religious service and threatening peaceful citizens. I suggest you leave now before charges are added to the list." Jenkins' face flushed with anger. "You choosing sides, Marshal. Betraying your own kind for these. "I'm enforcing the law," Davis cut him off firmly. "Which applies to everyone, including you. Now back out of this church before I arrest you for disturbing the peace and threatening harm." For a tense moment, it seemed Jenkins might challenge the marshal directly. His sons shifted nervously, hands hovering near their weapons. The wedding guests sat frozen in their pews, many shielding children with their bodies. Caleb moved instinctively to place himself between Takala and potential danger, though she remained remarkably composed beside him. Finally, Jenkins spat on the church floor in a final gesture of defiance. "This isn't over, Remington," he warned. "You've made your choice, and this community will make you regret it." As the Jenkins family retreated, pushed firmly out the door by the marshal and his deputies, an audible sigh of relief swept through the remaining congregation. Reverend Thompson, who had stood his ground with remarkable calm throughout the confrontation, turned to Caleb and Takala with a gentle smile. "Shall we proceed? I believe we were about to witness a union blessed by God, regardless of what some men might think." The ceremony itself was brief but deeply moving. Takala and Caleb exchanged simple vows of love and fidelity, promising to stand together through whatever challenges life might bring, a commitment that held particular weight given the demonstration of hostility they had just witnessed. When Caleb placed the wooden ring on Takala's finger, promising to replace it with gold when they next traveled to Missoula, tears glistened in her eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thompson declared with evident satisfaction. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The small gathering erupted in applause, their enthusiasm seemingly amplified by the defiance of celebrating this union, despite the threats that had attempted to prevent it. Martha Blackwell had indeed organized refreshments, and the church basement became the setting for a modest but joyful wedding celebration. For the first time since arriving in the valley, Takala seemed fully at ease among the settlers, her natural grace and intelligence winning over even those who had harbored initial reservations. As they prepared to depart, Marshal Davis approached with news. "Jenkins and his boys rode straight for the saloon after I ran them off. I've got deputies watching to make sure they stay there until they're too drunk to cause more trouble." He lowered his voice. "But I'd advise caution in the coming weeks. Men like that don't forget perceived slights easily." "We'll be vigilant," Caleb assured him, his arm protectively around his new wife's waist. "And grateful for your help today." The ride home was accompanied by the same deputies who had escorted them to town, with plans for continued patrols through the night. Despite the lingering threat from the Jenkins family, Caleb and Takala found themselves filled with a quiet joy as they returned to the ranch, now truly their shared home. As they crossed the threshold, Caleb swept Takala into his arms in the traditional manner, eliciting a surprised laugh that warmed his heart. "Welcome home, Mrs. Remington," he said softly, as he carried her into the cabin that no longer felt like a solitary outpost, but the beginning of something far more precious. "Home," she repeated, the word carrying the weight of her journey from her lost family, through captivity and desperate escape, to this moment of belonging. "I never thought to find one again." That night, as husband and wife, they discovered a deeper intimacy than either had known was possible. Not just the physical union of marriage, but the profound connection of two souls who had each believed themselves destined for isolation until fate brought them together. In Takala's arms, Caleb finally understood that the frontier wasn't a place that demanded solitude as he had long believed, but rather a landscape that made human connection all the more vital and precious. Spring arrived gradually, the snow receding to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the thawing earth. With the changing season came a tentative peace. The Jenkins family maintained their hostility, but expressed it through cold shoulders and pointed avoidance rather than direct threats. The community, following the pattern established at the wedding, remained divided in their acceptance of the Remingtons' unconventional marriage, but the passage of time dulled the initial shock. Takala proved herself not just a devoted wife, but a valuable partner in the ranch operations. Her knowledge of plants led to a thriving vegetable garden that supplemented their diet and provided excess produce to trade in town. Her skill with animals, a heritage from her mother's people, helped improve the health of the cattle herd and resulted in a higher survival rate among the spring calves than Caleb had ever achieved alone. By late summer, as the ranch flourished under their joint care, Takala shared news that completed their transformation from unlikely allies to family. She was expecting their first child, due to arrive with the winter snow. "Are you pleased?" she asked hesitantly after telling Caleb, uncertain of his reaction to this new responsibility. His response was to lift her gently and spin her in a circle, his face alight with a joy she had never seen before. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it," he assured her, setting her carefully back on her feet. "Takala, you've given me everything I never knew I wanted, a true partner, a home filled with warmth instead of emptiness, and now a child who will carry the best of both our heritages forward." As her pregnancy progressed, they made plans for the future that now stretched before them with newfound promise. The ranch would need expanding to support their growing family. The cabin would require an additional room. Most significantly, they began discussing how to honor both traditions in raising their child, teaching both English and Apache languages, sharing stories from both cultures, creating a new kind of family that bridged worlds rather than divided them. On a crisp December evening, almost exactly 1 year after Caleb had found Takala stumbling through the snow, their daughter was born with the assistance of Martha Blackwell, who had become a steadfast friend and advocate. They named her Sarah Nayland Remington, Sarah after Caleb's mother, and Nayland meaning beloved in Apache. As Caleb held his daughter for the first time, gazing down at her perfect features that blended both parents, Takala's high cheekbones and copper skin, his own sage-green eyes, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in a single year. The lonely rancher who had once believed the frontier too harsh for love had discovered that love was precisely what the frontier needed most, not as a luxury, but as a necessity for survival. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully returning the infant to Takala's arms, "just like her mother." Takala smiled, exhausted but radiant. "She is a bridge between worlds, just as we have become. Neither fully of one heritage nor the other, but something new and stronger for the blending." As the first snow of winter began to fall outside their window, Caleb sat beside his wife and daughter, contemplating the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. The frontier remained as challenging as ever: harsh weather, difficult labor, occasional hostility from those who could not accept their union. Yet those very challenges had forged a bond between them that he knew would withstand whatever tests the future might bring. "I was wrong," he said softly, stroking his daughter's dark hair as she slept peacefully in Takala's arms. "About what?" Takala asked, looking up at him with curious eyes. "About everything," he admitted with a smile. "I thought the frontier was no place for love, that isolation was safer than connection. I thought I needed to stand alone to survive." "And now," she prompted gently. Caleb leaned forward to press a tender kiss to her forehead, then to his daughter's. "Now I know that true strength lies in what we build together, that love doesn't make the frontier weaker, it makes it worth fighting for." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the land in a pristine blanket of white much as it had the day their paths first crossed. But this time, as darkness settled over the Montana wilderness, no loneliness accompanied it, only the quiet certainty that within the walls of the Remington Ranch, a family had found its home, bridging cultures, defying expectations, and proving that even in the harshest landscapes, love could take root and flourish against all odds.